me to that.
Like a lot of other churches, we're heavy on older generation, with a handful of families, one of which Sam, who's coming later in this week, is going to be here. This dinner, including our pastors, one of our pastors is very young with a young family, wife, they both work. Both our pastors, they both work with children. This dinner ended up, once we started it, to be mandated 100% of our young families come to this dinner. 100%. We never realized that how just one day a week that they didn't have to, the wife who commutes to New York City from Central Jersey, spending 3 hours on a train and so forth, and having kids in schools, what a gift that would be to not have to think about what they were going to plan for dinner or make dinner, and then come into a room where their kids can sort of be parented by who's ever there, the 100-year-old, the other parent. It's tremendous.
And hold this story, Sharon, because on Wednesday we'll have opportunities to say, how might we think about this in the broader sense? And that's a perfect exemplification of it. So just getting back, so the plan is that then on Wednesday we'll meet together, and you can see it's cultivating the conversation with your church leaders and congregations, and then experimenting with intergenerationality in your churches, ultimately with the goal to move to worship. I should say right from the very beginning, I am a firm believer that no child, youth, anyone, even babies should be removed from the worshiping body. I think it is the most essential hour or 2 hours or time we spend of the entire week as believers and as Christians. And I think that, and that's to say, if there's a crying baby, you don't take them out. My policy is, if a baby is screaming, then you would want the mother to take them out. But if someone else is screaming, I would hope you would usher them out too. So I just have a general intergenerational no screaming policy in church. But I remember, that challenge of saying, how do we express ourselves as a body? And the goal is very much so, how do we get to the place where our worshiping times, our corporate worship, actually are more integrated, and not just in a way that is purely, and a word that you'll become familiar with is accommodation, the way we accommodate one another. Because the children are actually doing the heavy lifting of accommodation in the most important time of our week of worship, whereas there should be some sense of mutuality in that accommodation, because that's a burden they bear, and we're like, what, for the sake of what? So I can hear a sermon without being interrupted? Well, in an era of podcasts and other media formats, you can listen to 1,000 sermons in a week, and to deprive our children of that, and to separate our children because of that 20 to 30 minute little window of the proclamation of the word, is a travesty for the for Christianity as a whole. So the plan is this: we're going to do this tonight. We'll go for a little less than an hour. What I want to do is I want to kind of frame the information and for a way for you thinking in a practical theological expression, and then I'm going to dive into the idea of why this is an issue and why it's even important. But the ultimate goal is to cast a new vision for a different type of ecclesiology. How do we exist not as a church that has an intergenerational component, like it's a paradigm we're plugging in, like it's a new program, or like, oh, let's just, because and that's one of the temptations we'll talk about on Wednesday. The idea if you put things too fast or you put things and segment it too quickly, everyone in the church says, oh, you're doing an intergenerational thing. I don't have kids, I'm not going. So let's get started with the idea of a practical theological framework. I would say my 2-second version, or a 2-minute version or less of, if you're not familiar with the different fields of practical theology, there are 4 general categories: systematic theology, which studies the doctrines of the church; historical theology, which studies the history of the church; biblical theology, which studies the Bible; and practical theology, which people are like, what the heck are you guys doing over there? Is it applied theology? Like, is it, that seems like an oxymoron. How does it fit? Practical theology is a methodological discipline that is not about the application of theology, but about the intersection of theology and a religious phenomenon and religious experience and the social sciences and philosophy. So what we do as practical theologians, we take our experiences within the church, how we experience the church, how we experience community, how we experience formation, and we interpret that through the lens of the social sciences with an aim of better understanding what's happening on the ground, better understanding what's happening in the field. And also, and this is the difference between a religious sociologist. A religious sociologist does that in reverse. They begin with the field of sociology, they train in to be a sociologist and to understand human structures and developments and that sort of thing, and then they study a religious community. But religious sociology does not require faith convictions, whereas practical theology does, because it asks the question, what's actually happening? So the framework in the school of thought that I have trained in is called the consensus model, it asks three questions. The first question is called the descriptive, and I can't spell if I'm talking, so the descriptive moment. And it asks the question, what is happening? Now, this is one of the main questions that brings us into the conversation tonight. And we're going to spend some time on this tonight. What's happening in our culture? What's happening in our churches? And I heard many of you say, our churches are aging. Our churches are losing young people. Our churches are losing family. In fact, one of the biggest things in pastoral hirings right now are the idea or the possibility that someone might be attractive to younger families, because we just think we just need to repopulate the church and it'll be fine. So that's an identification of a problem we'll talk about in a minute. But this idea of descriptive moment can apply to anything in your own ministry context. You'll say, well, things just don't seem right. Well, then the first duty is to describe what's happening. And then this is the empirical moment. Like, what do I see? What am I observing? And the theory behind the descriptive moment is that it gives a problem the spotlight. And if you can identify the problem, then and it doesn't have to be you understand the problem. It can just be identify the problem. There's an issue, I feel it, I can sense it, let me describe it, here's where I pinpoint it. You may draw some lines of connections like a big crime case. But then that leads you to your second point, which is the interpretive. Which asks the question, why is this happening? And what this does in the practical theological move is makes a turn towards the social sciences, to outside sources that don't relate to Christian experience. So when I said before, practical theology takes religious phenomenon and interprets it through social science lenses, that's where this is going to come into play. In order to do that, I'm going to look at some socialization theories from Peter Berger. We're going to talk about some practice-based belonging or inclusion theories called situated learning theory. And we're going to also talk about communal memory, which is a huge piece to our understanding of intergenerationality, because it's the idea of faith formation in a communal environment. And in fact, we'll turn to a guy named Paul Connerton tomorrow to sort of unpack that. And the idea is that if you're not in a intergenerational community, you don't receive the significance from the essential practices or rituals that define that community. And as a consequence, well, the result is maybe what's up here, that young people are leaving the church or they're not connected to the church. But he takes the Eucharist, for example, and says, for 2,000 years we've been practicing this Eucharist. It's meaningful today, as it was in the first century, but why? Why does that last, and what has kept that together? So that's the interpretive piece. And then tomorrow we're also going to then say, three, what ought to be happening, and this is called the normative moment. And that says, what ought. And what ought to be happening is both universal in the sense of the Christian expression of faith, because we are all using the Bible as a sacred text. We're all using the history of the church as a sacred text, a living text. But then we also have some distinctives. So from the Methodist Church to the Presbyterian Church to a non-denom church to to whatever background one comes from, there's going to be faith convictions. And this is where, as an aside, this is the primary reason that I am writing the book that I'm writing. One of the biggest reasons is most of the views out there surrounding intergenerational formation suggest things that I think are not true about the Bible. The suggestion is that intergenerationality is present in the Bible, and we can see the Bible. And the Bible carries stories that present in other words, like when the whole nation of Israel was gathered around Joshua, and or David calls everyone together and says, the children and the manservants and the maidservants and the cattle, and they just bring everyone together. And the idea is that everyone was there, so it's intergenerational. Well, if we understand intergenerational in the light of the conversation that's happening right now, it doesn't apply. And so this has been one of my biggest beefs, but this is also, and I think most of us here are Presbyterian or from some mainline. I know that, so you're with a very liberal crowd, Cliff, which I know but just from your background. But I mean, if you grew up Methodist, but I think that the more liberal perspective as well of intergenerationality has not been represented in the current literature that's out there. Words like inclusion and equity and transgenerational have been erased from the conversation because those who are leading the conversation right now tend to be more from an evangelical background. And that's one of the things and one of the passions I have for this book is that I think there needs to be a broader voice that is inclusive of all perspectives, not to mention those who ascribe to the current sort of main texts out there are not mainliners, they're not covenantalists, and when we get into the theology, we'll talk about the covenantal theology, as a basis for intergenerationality. And so when you come into things like covenantal theology, you start talking about infant baptism, and that's been largely rejected as well. So there's been a major divide in this area. So if you've read anything about intergenerationality before, some of this will seem familiar, some of this will seem familiar, but if you've read anything that's out there, this is where the newest material is going to come to play. But again, this says what should be happening. Well, I'm suggesting in all of this that we should be worshiping together on Sunday mornings as a corporate body, and we should be adapting that worship in such a way that it allows all generations to have some sense of reciprocity, of mutuality, of accommodation, of inclusion, and of equity. And those are 5 terms you'll get familiar with tomorrow, and they're 5 terms that came out of really what was the most international gathering around of thought leaders around the idea of intergenerational. And the last one, if you will, and this is the one that most people want to jump to. Most people don't want any of this other stuff before up here. They just want to get down to here. But this is the pragmatic moment, or the practical moment. Pragmatic. I started writing pragmatic and went into practical. The pragmatic movement. And this says, what now? So in other words, given what is happening, given how we understand it, given what we think should happen, is there a corrective that then makes this full loop? And what it does is it really creates a spiral that basically never ends. You probably have heard the term praxis at some point. A lot of times people use the word praxis as a replacement for the word practice. It's like a fancier, more academic sounding word than practice. But praxis and practice are actually 2 different things. Praxis is the intersection. This is praxis right here. And what it is it's the intersection of theory, let's put the T there, and theory and practice itself. And then what happens is you consider theory, you go down here and you experience practice. And then you come down here and you're like, well, I need to revise some of those theories now because I'm learning stuff. The practice becomes the new empirical moment. And you go to theory again, and then you come back around here and do practice. And what this model, which is called the consensus model, does, and this is out of Princeton Seminary, a guy named Richard Osmer, is that this is what makes it different. The primacy, the most important thing we do is to understand this context because it's the normative. It's the big building blocks that make why we do what we do important. You could say, well, we've lost intergenerationality in the whole culture, so it's not surprising that the church has as well. But the church is always meant to be an exemplification of God's highest and most rich gift to the human species, which is community, which is the sense of being with one another, a sense of belonging, a sense of self-giving. I'm sure it'll eke out throughout the week for those of you who spend the week, but even over the next few days, I'm very much into this dichotomy recently of we are called to be creatures of self-giving, not self-preserving. And I think that in intergenerationality, we find the deepest expression in the church of self-giving. For those of you of a more liberal persuasion, I would think most of you, who, and like many of us, even growing up in the Assemblies of God, a very conservative church, like diversity was a huge thing for us. In fact, I think my Assemblies of God church was far more diverse than my Presbyterian church. And amazingly enough, the AG ordained women way back when. Like I grew up, I didn't. Yeah, I mean, it's so shocking. I was like, man, this little progressive, it's a charismatic denomination. And now it's not to say that it's perfect, but in some cases, the fact that they ordained women before the Presbyterian churches should be an interesting thing. But what I will say is this, and this we'll get in, and we'll get into this a little bit more probably on tomorrow afternoon. We want a diverse church. We say we want to be an inclusive church. And usually when we use those terms, diversity, we're usually pointing towards racial diversity. That's just and when we say inclusive, we're pointing towards LGBTQIA plus issues. Those are the translations. If you say diversity, you're talking about race. If you say inclusion, and not to say that they're not interchangeable, but I'm of the opinion that we will never have diversity in the church until we are an true diversity in the church until we are an intergenerational church. Because true reconciliation in the body, in the corporate worship, requires flexing our sense of what we think should happen or not happen, and allowing others to be able to speak into that. And it's kind of like we will say, oh, welcome, and you can come in and be just like me. Well, that's not embracing the diversity that's out there. It's saying you can come in and you can accommodate what you want to get something out of what I have in order for me to remain the same. And when we talk about intergenerationality, it's talking about it's not in there's a term, and we'll talk about that tomorrow, the term intersectionality, which has a whole school of thought attached to it. But the notion of intersecting with another generation is something that is both spiritual, it's phenomenal, and it's actually it is far beyond our understanding of. It's not just about me and you, if we're of generation just hanging out and doing something, even in games. It's not about the game itself, it's about what happens in that relationship. And I'm going to make the argument that ultimately it's the Holy Spirit that drives this. That intergenerationality is about the Holy Spirit and holy moments that define and intersect our relationships. And part of that is the devaluing of the power dynamics that exist. Yes, we all have responsibilities, we all have roles, and they're there as a part of us. But at the base of that, if we truly believe that this world is not our own and that we're resident aliens and that there is something on the other side of this, and I don't think for the vast majority of us in Christian ministry and Christian service, this is something we're like, well, of course we believe that. But if we truly believe that, then to look at someone younger or someone of a different skin color or someone of a different orientation and to judge them based on their physical, material essence or being, is it precisely the very thing, it's prioritizing our lives in this world over and against someone else. And that's what we're really sort of seeking to sort of break down those structures. So if we really want to be a diverse and inclusive church, I think really the first way to say to our churches who are moving in that direction is say, well, if you haven't considered intergenerationality, if you can't bend your worship and reconsider how you glorify God in your corporate body, you can't reconsider that in relationship to your own children, how will you ever more than just, sort of as a token witness of saying we're a diverse church? It's kind of like the minute you get someone of another ethnicity to come into your church, you're like, hey, let's take some pictures and use them. And I remember in the national office, they were pulling all sorts of people, and it was a big joke. Like, if you're white, they were like, we're not, I'm not getting chosen. And so I'm half Filipino, so I was like, but I always get my racial identity stripped from me because I present white, and I'm always like, hey, Filipino guy over here, and they're like, nah, you're too tall for Filipino. Yeah, Sharon, did you steal this?
No, it's mine, I'm loaning it to you so we can read what you're writing.
Oh, is that too light?
Mm-hmm.
At the end of this.
You carry a big marker around?
What color do you want?
No, yeah, we may use, there's markers over
Right
there.
here.
Okay, so to that end, here's what I'd love to do. I would love, and you can do, and if you want paper, we can tear off some paper. If you're not a note taker, don't take notes. The goal of this is this. For me, so my hope is that you will grow in your knowledge and understanding of, and hopefully this information will be presented to you, and it should, and theoretically come out in a way that helps you sort of track the argument through. I am very much into the construction of an argument. I've had many passes through this material and teaching it in different time frames. So I have it broken up in a way that follows this format. And I'll leave this up here, and you can flip this back at any time if you want to look at it. I'll just flip it over. But the goal is this: you will learn the best way you know how. So if taking notes is what you need to do, that's fine. If there's paper and you want to scribble it out, if you just want to sit and absorb, that's fine. At the end of this gathering, and I'll extend it now, but you can let me know, and it doesn't have to be right away. It can be a week from now, but obviously the sooner after the conference, the better. I'm going to invite you, if you would like, to journey with me as I write this. What you're getting is my verbal version. This is why I'm recording it, so that I can go all the little bits and pieces that somehow I can transcribe and sort of see what I said. I've probably written about 50,000 words on this already, and I need to kind of compile it all together and allow it to come out in a way that follows a format. And the format I'm going to present to you is the format of the book, the 15 chapters of the book. And so if you're not a note taker, or you just want to sit and listen, that's great. You want to be a part of this. I'm going to invite you now. At the end of this, you can continue journeying with me over the next 6 months or so as I write this. I'm going to invite those who want to meet with me, even if just one of you, to meet with me on Zoom if you want to. If none of you want to, that's fine too. I'll venture out on my own. But I want to. And I guess my point in saying that is, if you want to carry on in this conversation, you may not know. You'll have access to the videos. 2, you can join that or not join that. But if you join it and you're reading the stuff and you're going through different versions and you've heard it here, you're going to obviously internalize it in multiple ways. I personally think that what I have constructed for this book is really and not the most clear elucidation, but I think the most theologically faithful elucidation. And when InterVarsity Press contracted me to rewrite Intergenerational Christian Formation, which is the Bible of intergenerational Christian formation right now, so I refer to the Bible as sort of the main text. InterVarsity Press contracted me to write that with Holly Allen, to rewrite it.
That's your editor.
What's that?
That's your editor.
No, that was the woman. Holly Allen and Christine Ross were the original authors of Intergenerational Christian Formation. It came out in 2012 through InterVarsity Press. It has probably sold the most copies of any intergenerational book in the conversation. And Holly came to me and said, "Will you rewrite this book with me?" And this is not for public knowledge, but Christine was brought into that, and because she was one of the original authors, and 3 of us were contracted to rewrite it. Well, when we came to the theological impasse, and we'll get to that a little bit more tomorrow, I broke contract because they wanted to go back to the original expression of the biblical view of intergenerationality, and I was like, that's not in there. I can't do it. I can't have my name on something. And I was the hardest decision I had to make in my life, is I'm like, people are like, just go with it and just, write your own thing. And I said, no, I as a theologian, I want to have integrity in what I believe, and I think they're wrong. And I have to find a way to say that without looking like a jerk. So maybe you can all help me do that too. But one of the things that InterVarsity Press said to me was that the reason they were willing to rewrite Intergenerational Christian Formation was because they were bringing a theologian in. It's what it lacked. And so I'm hoping with this endeavor that I'm going to fill a gap. And that's a long way to say, and I'm very grateful for you all to journey with me through this. So before we get started in sort of the first section of this problem of dealing with the descriptive, any questions or thoughts? Does anyone want to stretch? You wanna stand? We're gonna go for about another half an hour, is that okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
You okay, all right. Any initial questions? Before we dive into it? Okay, so this is, I would say that the first thing is sort of the overview of how we got into this, or why are we talking about this? Why is this important? And I want you just to think about it in a group of 6 people. You all expressed similar sentiments. You all have expressed, you have also echoed sentiments that exist in the church at large. We're losing young people in the church. And I don't even have to start with describing our churches, because we could take the time to say, well, let's make a profile of all our churches, see what's out there. And every church is going to say the exact same thing. We're losing people, we don't know why. We're losing young people, we don't know. And in fact, history proved itself correct in terms of stats in the world. This is the largest exodus of youth and young adults from a religious organization or institution in the history of human civilization. There has been never this type of departure or hemorrhaging, or whatever words you want to throw in there, of young people leaving. So do you concur? We'll just start with that premise. Is that something that you're experiencing in your church? I'm seeing nods of heads.
Sure.
And we all are saying why. And so what we do is we hope that if we hire a pastor who's charismatic, who can draw young people in, we hope that we can get the hipster youth minister or children's worker who comes in and will draw families in. We're hoping that if we can use whatever the latest, shiniest object is, that somehow we can tease people into our church under the auspice that if we can just have a little tweak or a little corrective, that the whole thing is going to turn itself around. And I think this is my issue with VBS. Not that the notion of having a vacation Bible school or time to get together is a bad idea. Great idea, lovely idea. I think there's lots of ground to explore there. But why do we do VBS? Do we really do it to catechize our children in the faith? No, we do it because we want to offer a spirituality for the community. We want to invite the children of the community, and really what we end up being is daycare, babysitter, drop off. And the hope is, and every VBS goes the same, we want to tell you that Jesus loves the world, and that Jesus loves you, and that Jesus, there's usually 4 or 5 days, and that Jesus died for you, and that you can love Jesus too. This is the main stretch of almost every VBS curriculum, and it's all predicated on the idea that if we can offer something fun and exciting in our churches, the children will come in, and then what do we all do? Well, we always teach them a theme song in VBS, and then we invite all of the children to sing that theme song on the next Sunday morning after VBS in the hopes that they'll bring their parents. They'll be sitting on the front pews with their cameras, taking photos of their child singing, as if that matters to anyone. And the deeper hope is that perhaps those people, the first time in their church, will say, this is where I want to go. And then they're going to somehow become members and start tithing.
Can I tell you that this church educator hates traditional VBS with every fiber of my being, and I threw it in the trash.
Good on you.
I'll tell you what later.
But is it so? Here's the thing. Yeah. If you don't think what I'm saying is, if there's any, yeah. So yes, this is what we do, and that's just one example of the many ways we try to get people into the church to solve this issue. Now, the reality is, when you look at this from a very broad cultural perspective, we're going through a period of secularization. It happened in Europe. It's happening here. It's a philosophical shift in the way people think about knowledge and the way they think about their relationships with others, and that's happening. And it really echoes in many ways. Have you ever heard of Phyllis Tickle? Anyone Phyllis Tickle?
Oh, yes.
The Great Emergence?
Yes.
So if you haven't, is it familiar? So look,
yes.
so here's what Phyllis Tickle says, is that basically the church has changed over a period of about 2,000 years. And it's every about 500 years that you see a major shift. The first, now if this is Jesus here, The first major shift actually happens in the early 4th century, and we'll just put it at 325 at the Council of Nicaea. And what happened prior to that was Constantine had a vision, converted to Christianity, and then began the process to turn the Roman Empire into the Holy Roman Empire. And it ended in 381 with Theodosius actually legalizing Christianity and sanctioning it as the official religion of the West. And therefore everyone all of a sudden overnight became Christian. Now I have to compare that to say, could you imagine if, like, let's say Muslims came in, or Mormons all of a sudden were in power, and they're like, everybody is Mormon. And you're like, what? I have my own belief system. And you're like, nope, you got to get rid of that belief system. You're now Mormon, and we need to pass out underwear for everyone. So everyone line up, and we're going to hand out our underwear. But this is what happened with, and so then they're like, yeah, we don't need to do a sacred ritual because there's too many of you. So we're just going to send it through UPS, and you'll get it and just wear it on. So this is kind of what happened with baptism. In this period between here, we baptized a lot of Christians. We created infant baptism doctrines. We used palm leaves because they were just, everyone was Christian overnight. But in this period, you have the beginning of what we call early Christianity, and by the end of it, we came out with the first expression of theology, and we also came out with the first creeds of the church. Well, what happened is those grew around 700. We had, in this period, we have a decline called the fall of Rome. There were some invasions and things, and really Christianity didn't stick at that time because they were just like, Christian, 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 and people were like, what? Culture is falling, screw you. So, so everything sort of fell, and then over this period, and around this, or I guess as we've been, wait a minute, this is 1000. So around the 700 mark, in between this period, what you have is you have this guy named Gregory the Great, Gregory G. And he basically took Western Christianity as expressed through Benedict of Nursia, so Saint Benedict. And he implemented it through all of Christianity from the period of about 650 to the period about 700. And by the time that came, in Cluny, in a little town in France, Western monasticism grew, and Western Christianity grew. And what happened during this period was Orthodox Christianity, which was going along here, split with Latin Christianity or Western Christianity. And so they had this fracture here. And this was and then this fracture happened at 1054, at something called the Great Schism. And for those of you who are interested in history buffs, the Great Schism points to the division of around a word filioque, which says that the Spirit came not just from the Father, but also from the Father and the Son, fili meaning son. And so this word theoretically is the big reason that the Eastern West divided in terms of Christianity globally. But really what it had to do with power, just want to put that under, is the Roman Catholic Church was saying, oh, there are all these bishops or patriarchs in the East, and we have one in Rome in the West. And he said, this one in the West in Rome is the first among equals. So I don't know how that works. It's kind of like, you can stay out as late as you want, as long as you're home by 10. So it's that oxymoron. And so they're like, yes, I'm first among equals. Well, then you're not, then there's not equal. And it misses the point. So this fractured the church here in 1054. And so the Orthodox Church just kept doing their thing. They weren't really changed much. But the Latin Church, or what eventually became the Roman Catholic Church, and this didn't exist until you have the Reformation, and obviously that happened around the 1500s plus. And you have Luther and Calvin and Zwingli come along the scene. Right. And what you have here in that Roman Catholic Church is a fracture here. And that came about a fracture of authority as well. Authority of the church to charge indulgences, the notions of what I think purgatory coming out of more influencing our ideas around the Dante's Divine Comedy influenced our ideas around hell more than biblical narratives. And so you have this major split in the church. And this is where really the emergence of the Roman Catholic Church begins, because it was just the Catholic Church before that, or the Western Church, or the Latin Church. So when Protestant then comes, and you have this fracture, and the Protestant goes this way, and this is the Protestant theme, and the Roman Catholic Church continues. And then, as you know, Protestants then grew to Anglicans, into Methodists, into Presbyterians, and Lutherans, and then others. And so by the time you have this sort of thing, you have like this just, tree root or sort of cellular structure that just spreads everywhere. over 2,000 denominations worldwide in some variation. We went from one church, in the early church, and again, and what you see in that is every 500 years, there's a different break. And we are in that 500-year period now.
We're at the end of it.
We're at the very end of it.
We're at the end of it, and
And we're redefining ourselves through it. And what's interesting about that is you all have heard the term postmodernity. It was a big term like 10 years ago or something, 20 years ago. Modernity brings us really from the 1500s, you have a period about 750 of the Enlightenment. And this is, I think, therefore I am. This is the heart. Actually, I would say the Reformation. 1750. The Reformation really was the beginning
yes.
of individualistic society, because it broke down the norms that the Roman Catholic Church said, this is what we view society in the world. This is our cosmology. And someone was like, that's not my cosmology. That's not my theology. Go on.
Phyllis Tickle actually said, I saw her about 5 years ago before. When she passed, I think.
In the last decade, yeah.
Yeah.
But she talked to her before she died.
She came to our presbytery, and I'm sitting there listening, and I'd read the book before she came, and I was like, you gotta be kidding. This can't be. And she tracks. She really tracks this every 500 years. And she said, this transition will be unbelievably difficult.
Yeah.
And just.
It's the first one that's been personified by individualism.
But yes.
And this, what happened here was in the field
true.
of epistemology, or which is a philosophical word to mean how we know what we know. It went from institutional and religious institutional, but societal institutional, academic institutional knowledge that defined how we understood truth, and slowly over about 250, really about 200 years, or I guess about 200 a little more years, because really they say that around, and again, I tend to talk in decades, I'll do this around generational theory too, but in the 1950 was when often people will place the beginning of postmodernity. And what happened in between here was the modern era, which defined everything within the academic sphere and in the scientific and technological sphere through rationality. That which made sense. There was a right, there was a wrong, and you followed a method to understand and to prove text. This is why in the last century, prior to the 1950s, or around the last throw of the modern era, you have Billy Graham and other apologists of the church who were offering proof existence. There's a whole genre. You go to your local thrift store, and you'll see hordes of these books. But proof existence for God, saying this is how. Let me show you with some method how God exists, which takes all of the faith out of it, because you can't be certain through any sort of proof method. As Anne Lamott said, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. And what they tried to do was create a certainty about if you say a prayer, you'll get into heaven, and that's the way we ended the era. But 1950s brings about a new era, and it was really seeded much before this, and you can actually see, and I think evangelicalism actually had its hand in that as well. And just as an aside, the reason inerrancy, prior to the 1820s, we talk about the inerrancy of the Bible, prior to the 1820s did not exist.
Yeah.
Sacredness and inerrancy were held in tension. And inerrancy became the mantra of the growing evangelical movement in the early 1800s, because they were doubling down on the notion of the infallibility of the Pope and the Church from the Reformation forward. And so the sola scriptura that comes out of the Reformation, Scripture alone, that means that we're, instead of the Pope, we're doubling down on the authority of Scripture. And then as that changed, and new interpretation began to arise in the Enlightenment, for about 50 to 70 years, all of a sudden people said we need to double down on our understanding of Scripture and make it the pure authority. Anyway, all that's to say is we're in a major shift in the church. And I think that before, and I'll say this on Wednesday too, before any conversations about anything changing or need to change to a new ecclesiology in the church, this is the basis of that. And the reason I say that is because we have major shifts in the church for the last 2,000 years, last 1,500 years in particular. We've seen these major shifts, and we now, knowing this and understanding the pattern, understanding, and this gels with generational theory, understanding these patterns, it should change the way we envision what the church should be. And we're not necessarily trying to recover at any of these points, and I would say we're not even trying to recover an early church model, because the cultural narrative there was patriarchy full on. Children were definitely property still here. Women were starting to, you see, but really you don't see until the last 2,000 years do you see that shift where women and children are actually considered valuable. Now, my argument in this is, and I do believe in evolutionary biology, and I'm not an early church person. I mean, an early earth person. In fact, I said in my sermon yesterday, the notion of end times is amazingly heightened by people within a early earth view, even though it's the last third of that time period of humans on this earth, which, end days, like the last third is end days. Whereas when you look at the earth as millions of years old and billions of years old, 2,000 years can still be last days. In fact, 2,000 years can turn into 10,000 years as the last days. But depending on one's perspective on that. But what it means is that we're in a time and a shift where we don't need to recover something through the history of the church. We need to ask that in light of our understanding and our evolution as human beings, so that we can see one another with empathy, and we can look at someone who is a different sex or a different ethnicity or a different income level or a different ability in any of those spectrums that we're all on, and say, I can see you as a person. And because of that new era that's only been really has come about in the last probably 25 to 50 years, this really sort of full person and how do I see you as an individual, is what has given rise to our capacity to see young children as just as equally important to the church as we are. This would never have happened prior to the 1900s, ever. There's no one who would ever said, look at this little kid here. And in fact, Bonnie Miller McLemore in her book, Let the Children Come, talks about how prior to the 1900s, children were actually considered liabilities. Considered assets.
They put them in mines.
Well, that's why they were assets. Why did you have a big family? Because you needed to work the fields. The more people you had, and the minute a child could pull a strawberry off of a plant, they became an asset to a family unit. And then around that period of the turn of the century of the late 1800s to the 1900s, when urbanization came into play, and you started to have families cluster all of a sudden, and then at the beginning of the war, around the time of the end of the beginning, or through the beginning of the First World War, when primarily the men went off to war and then the women filled their jobs. Well, when the men came back from war, the women did no longer had those jobs, and the children all of a sudden had no role. And they were kind of left out. And so this is what brings from the basically 1880s up to the 1920s, Stanley Hall eventually coins the term adolescence. Because all of a sudden, the kids who had a role in society no longer had a role. They weren't being educated, so they floundered in the world. And so you had this sort of category of moratorium where youth were just sort of out there. Now, bear with me for one more foray for about 15 minutes, and then we'll end for the night, and we'll pick it up tomorrow. What I want to give you sort of in a very broad stroke situation is how all of what I've said about over the last 2,000 years boils down to the last 120 years. Really the last 100 years from the 1920s. And this comes out of the notion of generational theory. Because the problem, again, is why young people are leaving the church. And there's all sorts of things that say, well, in the Gen Xers, those of us who were born between the 60s and the 80s, we came back to church because we had kids. Robert Withnow wrote a book called After the Baby Boomers. He's a professor at Princeton University. And he said, oh, don't worry. What we've seen this elongation of adulthood. I can't spell. And traditionally, you go back. Let's go even to the 1950s. Let's just go back 70 years. What were traditional signs of adulthood? Marriage. And when did that typically happen prior to the 1950s? Like 18 to 22?
22, yeah.
I mean, if you ended up in like the 25, 26 range, people, that was back in the day, people were like, what's going on, you know?
Yeah.
So what else was symbols of adulthood? Job.
First job.
Job, stable job,
Children,
children, which also happened earlier,
complete education.
education, okay,
Own a house.
home ownership, also changing, because this oftentimes was passed to you.
Oh.
So it wasn't always like, hey, let's get a starter home, and then let's get a bigger home, and let's get a, there wasn't this sort of trajectory of home ownership in a sense of, and amazingly enough, it's reversed. But these are the main ones. And the reason marriage happened is because sexual norms were different. And so you couldn't just be sexually free in the same way people are now. So if you were going to be sexually active, marriage was encouraged. That usually predicated children. Why? Prior to the 1950s?
There was
No birth control.
birth control, right.
Consequences were real. You didn't mess with it. Education was primarily for men. And home ownership was something that, again, was passed down and sometimes seen differently. Now, these things all generally happen between, I would say, 18 to 25 years of age. So by the time a child was 18, they were considered a legal adult. By the time they were 25, they usually were considered a functional adult in society. They had children by that point, at least one child. One of them had a job. Now, what's happened over the 1960s in that period, and we'll get to this in more detail in a second, but this all changed. And in fact, young adulthood, as we understand it, used to be 18 to 25 or 18 to 26, and that's when they'll kick you off your insurance. And then about 10 years ago, and then in a very short amount of time, 10 years ago, it was 18 to 29. Now, sociologically speaking, it is 18 to 34. 35 is where they believe adulthood properly begins.
That's called adolescence?
So that's interesting you say that, because when we started talking about young adulthood, the first thing they used to refer to it as extended adolescence. Now the reason is because they weren't, and the biggest indicator is these things,
they weren't happening.
Each successive movement, they started happening later and later and later. And now you got early 30-year-olds who have never been married. Why? Because they have sexual activity outside of marriage. I'm not here to put sexual norms on anyone, but with contraceptives, that allows you to be sexually active.
Pill was invented in the late 60s.
The pill was invented in the late 60s, and that's what actually mitigated the children. And
got the woman to work also.
And education was open to women because of women's liberation and things that, for sort of 40s through 60s, which gave careers a higher importance. And then no one cared about homeownership, and that's a whole nother issue, because you were mobile, you were moving around, you were dynamic. The idea of couplehood came into play. There used to be courting for the intention to be married. Now the idea of couplehood, and you'll hear people say this all the time, like, oh, we have children, but we need to go out and have our couple time, or our and I'm not saying that is not a thing, and that is a reflection of the way this has happened over the last 100 years. But the truth is, prior to the 1950s, there was no couple time. Not that there weren't dates, not that you maybe went out to something, but it wasn't like, hey, we need us time, because there was never a we before. You went from a collective family unit into a marriage relationship, you began having your own children, and in a collective environment, you didn't even have to figure out how you're going to raise those children because it was already expected of you. So all of this happened, and the very shift that we're seeing right now is largely predicated on the idea of young adults are leaving the church before the age now of 35. Now, chances are they're probably leaving the church more at like age 18, and if they have less involved parents, they're leaving after confirmation, whatever requirements they have. Once they've been confirmed in a mainline church, it's sayonara if their parents don't want them. If their parents make them go to church, it's usually till 18, and then the young people go to college, and then they have the phenomenon of what we call the lockbox, spiritual lockbox, where they take all of their spirituality, everything that we've given them, and they put it in a lockbox. And they don't throw the key out, and they take the lockbox with them. They don't leave it at home. They go to school with it, and they put it under their bed, and that's where it stays. Now, some very small fraction of students get involved in Christian ministries or university ministries or something like that. But the vast majority of it, and my son, I think, is included in that. Someone who's been, he's been raised by a theologian and a very devout Catholic woman who we have catechized our children, we homeschool our children, we teach my children know the history. We feel like we've given them every possibility to thrive. And my older son is, at St. John's College and doesn't even talk about in fact, his Hindu roommate or dorm mate spent a summer with us, and he wanted to talk to me about more of faith issues than my own son did. So there is some sense of, but once they hit that 22, 23 mark when they're graduated from college, most of them don't want to have anything to do with the church. And if they do, it's more because this comes into play, the children come into play. And it's really not about saying, hey, we now have little beings that we're responsible for. We want to make sure that they're spiritually thoughtful, that they actually, are engaged with some sense of the divine. It's usually, how do I know what's right and wrong? Well, that kind of comes from my religious background or my church, and I don't know how to raise my child in a moral education. Because in this day and age, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, but it's good to plant seeds. In this day and age, there's this issue called virtue ethics. And it's based on the idea that we learn excellence by doing practices, and we develop formation by choosing things that we see excellence in. And today, most values or norms are defined by what we are against than what we're for. For my more liberal brothers and sisters in the room, that is what, like for me, the church doesn't know why they are inclusive. The church doesn't know why they're anti-racist. We spout these things not because we have grounded theological an understanding of the issues, but because we don't want to be not accepting. We don't want to be.
You're wrong.
Trust
you're
me.
Wrong. I mean, as much as I preach, I pray you're wrong.
I'm saying that I think probably 10% people have a proper theological rationale for inclusion. And I think the rest of the church says, I don't want to be a bigot, I don't want to be prejudiced, I don't want to be associated with intolerance. And there's something in the Bible that says we should love everyone. And that's the extent of a theological basis for how they approach including anyone in the church, let alone their children or... I know, it's sad, but trust me.
No, but that's the basis for most of the things that people think about at church. That's the extent of the depth of it.
It is. Yeah. Well, you could say, and it's emotional reaction. I don't want to be associated with that. And on the flip side of that, on a more conservative perspective, there is a visceral reaction to alternative sexuality, and someone says, I don't want to be associated with that, so I'm going to choose my stance. My point in saying that, regardless of what side of that conversation you're on, people don't think through what they believe. They define their beliefs and their ethics and their morals by what they're against, not by what they're for. And that is what we need to raise our children with, the understanding of what they're for, because we're forming, and tomorrow we'll talk about how identity formation happens, giving children maxims, giving children baseline understandings of the way to view the cosmology of the world and the human's existence in it is critical to forming them in any sort of faith. Okay. Generational theory in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 8 minutes. You've probably heard terms like millennials, Gen Xers, boomers. These are all terms that we're familiar with.
Okay.
These are categories, these are words, these are nomenclature that have been given to certain generations by two men by the name of William Strauss and Neil Howe. Strauss is dead, Neil still exists. In the late 70s, early 80s, they developed a theory called generational theory. They're the ones who went through not just the last century, but went through the last 500 plus years of human history, all the way back to the late 1400s, I believe, and which is around the time of the invention of the Gutenberg's printing press, 1440. And my theory is the reason that we have the Reformation is not because we were dissatisfied with the church, but because we started to become more literate. And so because the printing press came about, we had access to literature, we learned to read. Over a century, we learned to read and started to read scripture when we had access to it on our own. We started saying, why am I listening to your authority when I can listen to my own authority? But you go all the way back, they trace, in generational theory goes all the way back, and what they basically say is every 18 to 22 years, you have another generational cycle. And then every 4 generational cycles, you get a 4th turning. And then it reverses itself and it goes in. And I'm not going to go into all the details. I was going to do that a little bit. Maybe we can start tomorrow that way. This is what I want to end with, the concept of the movement, and then tomorrow we'll get into how it's affected the church. But since the late 1400s, every 18 to 22 years, they have named a prototype or a generation. And every 4 years, it's called a saeculum. Every 4 years, it rotates. And every 4 years, you get 4 archetypes, you get 4 prototypes, and it affects. And so right now, if you and if you're interested at all in anything I'm saying right now, Neil Howe wrote his most recent book was The Fourth Turning. The Fourth Turning is here. I believe it's here or is now. And it's basically the predictions that they had for how society would function are all coming true. It's like scary. He's like a witch doctor or something, and they predicted this stuff. But we're not dealing with 500 years, we're dealing with the last 100 years. And there's lots of debate, and Strauss and Howe have put the dates, and say, what am I, a boomer? Am I a Gen Xer? Am I a millennial? Where do I fit in the structure? I think we're all either Xers or older. But in larger, people would want to put themselves in those categories. And I like to say it doesn't make a difference, because if you're on the cusp, you're going to be a blend of both sides anyways. But what I generally want to do is, and I'm not going to go back to the GI generation, but 20s to 40s are the boomers.
Great signals.
The silent.
Yeah, silent part.
40s to 60s are the boomers. And this is an easier way to remember, 60s to the 80s, and technically it's not. Strauss and Howe says either 81 or 83, they nuanced it along the way. You have Xers, 80 to 2000, which is where it gets a little dicey. Millennials, and then 20,000 or 2000 to 2020 are the Gen Z. Now, typically what you have here is you have this sort of cycle like this of children. So the silent generation, they're going to have children in the Xer. The very end of it and the early beginning of the boomers are going to have children in this generation. The vast majority of the boomers are going to have them in this generation, and the Gen Z are going to come out of the Xers. This fluctuates a little, but again, because of what was over here, the delayed if everyone was having babies between 20 and 25, this would have fed itself a little bit more predictable patterns. But as you've had this happen through here, things get a little muddy through here, and I would say that what you have is you have a major break here, and you have a major break here, and I'll talk about those in a second. But that leads us to this. Some people will say that millennials started in 1995 when smartphones started to come out, and it became the smartphone era. And Jean Twenge is an author who writes a book called iGen, or Generation Me, and she postulates that these dates are a little different. I think it's just too confusing. I like to go with the original generational theory, Strauss and Howe, and so I think the best way to talk about them and to think about them is in these terms, because it allows us to put decade blocks instead. I'm going to switch to a blue. Now, real briefly, let me just name a couple things that have happened over these generations. One, the silent generation. So another thing I should say is that within every generation, how they define and how they understand what's happened in that generational cycle is largely to do what happens in that person's life between the ages of 15 and 25. Now, why do you say that? Well, before 15, you don't have a lot of agency. You're kind of just doing what your parents do. By the time you're 15, you're becoming an individual. By the time you're 25, you're theoretically, in this schema, you should have been at some point in early adulthood. Now, I know we've extended that down here. But the idea is the major life incidences that happen in that coming of age period shape your ideology, shape your sense of vocation and place in the world, shape your sense of meaning. It's not that people aren't looking for meaning at 35 and at 40. These days, yes. But in that old schema of things, by the time you were 25, you should be done exploring your life and forming yourself. You should be now a productive member of society. So you have this major sort of shift, and what's happened, so in the silent generation, what were the major things happening in the 1920s? World War II? What else? Bomb? Yep.
With the stock market crash.
Stocks? And what did that lead to? Depression, okay. That's all you need right there.
Oh, yeah, that is good. That's what my mom would talk about,
Yeah.
is the depression and how
Yeah.
the poor they were.
And that's the silent generation. So they were the soft, they're quiet. So compare them down here with the Gen Zers. There are similar sentiments to the silence in the Gen Zers that replay themselves. But up here, the other thing you had in that silent generation is you had a sense of just sort of cultural decency or civil decency. You have Rotary clubs and women's clubs and Masonic clubs and Lions clubs. What were they all doing? They were gathering together for philanthropic endeavors. They were building parks and they were contributing to society. They understood their role in society in a democratic way that said, we the people, we're for the people, we're by, there was a sense of a golden era, the last golden era of what civil citizenship actually looked like. Now, what happened in this era was there were some things, and we'll talk about I don't want to get into the church side of it because then I'll get too deep into it, but there was a shift here during the boomer era. And we went from an era that was defined by morality and decency to an era that was therapeutic and individualistically focused. Now, the reason the boomers went into that era, I want to say, is not necessarily their own fault. The war ended. Things were rebuilding in our country. There was a big baby boom. They were born a part of this boom. Technology was on the rise. The domestication, what we talked about, the increase of women in education started to happen. But for those women who were still in the home, all of a sudden, all sorts of industrial products surfaced across the board. And so we were giving people, women in particular, in homes, more free time, which gave them a chance to sort of dream and to envision themselves in different roles, because now you had coffee makers and you had vacuums and you had electrical things that are actually making life easier. But at the same time, you also had a major shift in academia. It went from anthropology, which was the study of human groups, and you have that with Margaret Mead in the Samoa study. And that led to a period of the 1920s to the 1940s of sociological research. Will you say that, David?
I'm tracking, I'm thinking Timothy Leary.
And then you get into the very early parts of psychology. Now, the difference between sociology and psychology is one studies society or communities or groups of people, the other studies individuals. And I'm of the contention that this is one of the biggest shifts that we saw right here around this generation that centered study not on the development of communities around civil cooperation, around a sense of what it means to be a group of people together living in a diversifying early secularized era, to a place where they were saying, who am I as an individual? Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the book, Bowling Alone.
Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam.
Thank you.
The idea, and that's the same argument.
And the same thing true with I'll think of it in a minute. It's a purple book.
No, I know that.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is what happened. So you went from, so now all of a sudden, when you think about this psychological boom, Freud, Piaget, Erickson, many of these folks from the early 20th century who were bringing about theories of development. And not only that, but you don't just see it in society, you see it in education. The education movement started in the 1920s, and by the 1950s, you have a full-blown public education system that has divided our children into ages and stages because we understand them learning differently, because now we're studying the human cycle, human development, what's happening on these things. It's an explosion of understanding about the world and individuals, and this all happens between the 1940s and the 1960s. So what's the result of that? Well, if you're saying, who am I as an individual, then what you're doing is you're saying, How am I most realized as an individual? How do I experience myself in this world? There's a myopic focus that and this is this is nothing against boomers, but when you get that extension of adulthood, that's where it began. And that's not to say that women realizing and being able to be educated and realizing their own careers is by any way, shape, or form a negative thing, but it marks a shift in the way we understand everything across the board. And that individual fulfillment becomes, for women, education and educational opportunities and career opportunities, and for men in a growing technological world, as computers are just on the verge of coming into scene, to all of a sudden for banking, for technology, for IT, all these things start developing there, and where women sort of step into those roles in the same way as men went off to war and women filled those roles. Men went off to hyper banking and to the big slick and to all these things, and women started to populate that. Now we're still in a place where women are highly discriminated, pay disparaging, all this disparity, there's the word, pay disparity and all that sort of things. We're still in a place, but it's improving. We are moving slowly. The problem we have in our current culture is we're a microwave culture. We want everything like that. And we don't forget that slavery was dismantled over centuries, and it still exists in the psychology of people, but it takes centuries for things to change. But we're in a time of such rapid globalization, technological sort of communication, we expect things to happen overnight. But what happens is everything that happens overnight is ephemeral. It doesn't stick. This is what we're seeing in our politics, back and forth, liberal, conservative. We're not seeing progress in the same way we ought to, because progress is a slow, steady plodding course, not something that slings back and forth. But what happened here, and one of the consequences of the boomers going off and pursuing their own careers and ending up, what's happening is a double working home. And not for the sake of mom or dad, going down to the grocery store and picking up a second job while the kids are at school to sort of help make ends meet. It was like two full-blown careers. And then we moved to the extras, what we call our latchkey kids. I'm sure you've heard that term. We were the ones who went home, let ourselves in, watched some Scooby-Doo while we ate some Velveeta cheese or some, bologna, that sort of era. And we were left to our own devices. And so what you had in this era is you had a bunch of young people who really didn't have parenting. They were the most feral generation that we've had since probably the late 1800s, but even then they had responsibilities. But young people here weren't connected. And my theory is, this is where distrust started here. Boomers tried to reform in institutions. They tried to reform the church, which is why boomers brought us the mega churches and the evangelical churches and the seeker-sensitive churches. And the extras were the first to sort of deal with that. But the extras themselves developed a great distrust for authority and institution. Why? Where were our parents? We had no authority. We had no institutions. They weren't a part of those large blocks of our lives that were overseeing and contributing and guiding us in our moral and human formation. So as a consequence, you have extras. What I will argue tomorrow is a deistic view of the world. And by that means that the things that matter, the deism, the God that exists, is so far away, so distant, that God doesn't care about me in my everyday life. So it's a disconnect from authority, and therefore also a disconnect from God. And I think that's predicated from the disconnect we have with our parents, the lack of parental influence. Well, ultimately, that's to say, is by this time you had technology coming into play, and you had and really, when you think about from the 80s to the 2000s is one of the most explosive times of technology and of IT stuff. I mean, like by the end of 2000, we had smartphones. There was no such thing as a cell. I mean, there was on a higher technology, but not in a common use. In the 80s, even the 60s, you might have had some sort of car phone or something. But really, in a mainstream media, you had these millennials. But what happened in the millennials was that they grew up in a time of globalization, where they had access to everything all of a sudden. They were the first technological generation. one of the books, An Anxious Generation, that just came out not long ago, a big yellow book, talks about the fact that the reason that the millennials down to and it really is about the Generation Z, how they're the most anxious generation. He says, why? Because we have overprotected our kids in the real world. We don't let them go anywhere. We have to pick them up everywhere. We don't let them have any dirt in their faces. We everything has to be prepackaged, play dates. You can't just go wander and so we control their real life environment, but then we give them these devices and we're like, here. Oh, we put some protections on. The kids are like, yep, boop, 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 that correction's done, and I have my own device. And we're like, how'd you do that? Because they know more than we do. But what I think its name is Haidt. I don't remember his last name. But he argues that that we have given this openness to this world of a technological purview with no constraints. And so they're being protected in the real world to make them fearful of everything that's out there, but they're giving everything with no protections in front of them. And so what you have is the beginning of that starts in this millennial period. And what you have in that globalization, what you have in that technology, what you have in that era that went from MySpace to to blogs, to Facebook, to Instagram, to Snapchat. And actually you can trace those. Boomers like were the MySpace blog generation. Xers were Facebookers, and not to say that there aren't people dragging on each of these. Millennials were Instagram, and Gen Zers are Instant Chat and TikTok. And what happens, and just as an aside in these, is you go from rich discussions that were happening on blogs to snippets on Facebook to pictures with a caption on Instagram to not just little, and actually TikTok is probably the next evolution, but in between that you have Snapchat, and what you have in Snapchat is really short snippets that are like there for 5 seconds.
And it disappears.
And it disappears, and then it's ephemeral, you never have it.
Yeah.
So you went from deep discussions all the way down to almost nothing. And you track those movements and you start to see how it's affecting generations. But how that affected millennials is they began to patchwork their identities. One day I could be goth, the next day I'll be preppy, the next day I'll put on some Adidas and some gym pants and I can be sporty. And they started to express that through social media and technology, where they could change their identity literally overnight. You could go from one persona to another literally in one night.
Or you could just be whoever you wanted to be.
Or you could be whoever you want to be.
Anonymously.
Yes, you could be whoever anonymously.
Somebody different every day, but never you.
So yes, exactly. And I think that patchwork self, and this is where we're going to end today, but we won't get into Gen Z. We'll get into that tomorrow. Tomorrow what I want to do is I want to start with this same structure as we come together. And we're going to go through, and so ignore the schedule, we'll squish it together a little bit. But what I want to do is I want to look at this from the church lens. How this purview, how this structure, and I didn't keep going through the boomers. You had civil rights, you had sexual revolution, you had women's rights, you had women's suffrage, you had all those things that changed. Xers, you had wars, you had parents not at home. You had Watergate, you had distrust and and then millennials, you had not 9/11. That would be more of Generation Z, but actually with millennials too, even those born in the late 80s, by the time they were at 2000, if someone was born in the 80s and they were when 9/11 happened, they would be 20. So 9/11 would fit in there. That's that fear culture, that the effects of the boomers on that and technology and the way the use of the smartphone. Those all of these things and I will cover all of these in the actual book. I'll go through the individual examples. I'll fill in some of the blanks for the reader itself. But the flow is what we need, that I want you to understand. Because once you understand this flow and the way things have evolved over the last 100 years, you'll see how it affects the church. And then we'll have a deep understanding of why intergenerationality matters. Because as that age and stage from educational systems started happening through here, well, what did the boomers do? Is they reinvented church. They doubled down on the age and stage stuff. And we started separating our Sunday school classes. We started separating our youth ministries as we professionalized children's ministry and youth ministry from the 1970s to the present. It affects the way we understand. And what we did ultimately, and I'll begin that way tomorrow, is that we basically aged and staged or peer-oriented our young people out of the church. And why? because the very church that we want them to belong to when they're adults and full functioning members of society is never the church they were formed in. And I'll make this argument, and we'll talk about it tomorrow, that what we ultimately did was we put our youth ministry and our children's ministry and our college ministry and all these age and stage ministries out here in what I call the Van Gogh, it's called the One Ear Mickey Mouse by others, but I like a higher brow one. So I think you could put a little blood coming down here. But the Van Gogh Mickey Mouse is what I like to call it. But if this is our worshiping body, where we want our main church to happen, but we've constantly formed our kids because of this cycle out here, we can never expect them to reintegrate back in there.
That's what I say.
Amen.
All right, thank you for holding with me. That was a lot. Tomorrow will be a little like this. I love the interaction. Feel free to bring some interaction. And here's what I will say. Many of you have stories. We're going to hear some of those stories. I'd love to hear some of those stories. I'm going to invite you to consider writing down those stories, because this, again, you're sort of, if you want to stick with me over the next 6 to probably 8 months as I try to crank this thing out, the little stories, the little snippets of things that you contribute to these conversations will inevitably make them their way in there. But tomorrow we're going to pick this conversation up, a generational cycle, but through the lens of the church. Again, establishing what's the problem? Young people are leaving the church. And this is still the descriptive. This isn't why they're leaving the church. We'll get into that tomorrow. But what's happening over the last century affects why young people are leaving the church. And if you understand that flow of generational cycle, and that we're in a shift, and that there's a fourth turning here, again, along with Phyllis Tickle's understanding of a 500-year period, where we're in the fourth cycle period now. So we are in a critical time over the next 20 years in the church to both grasp what Phyllis Tickle is saying and what the generational theory shows us as we experience this fourth turning now. So, all right. That's my official end, but if there's any questions or thoughts, you're welcome to. Before we go there, just as a way of moving forward, I'm happy to sit around and chit chat about any of this right now if you want. There are some snacks in the other room. There's a couple bottles of bourbon that you're welcome to get in. There's ice in the refrigerator. I don't know if any of you, and if any of you want different types of drinks, there's just a store in walking distance down the street, or you can go. But
they don't mind.
We're allowed to bring our, so yeah, I have 2 bottles of bourbon in there. One we tucked into this afternoon a little bit. But there's games over there. Do you have Legos with you? We can put those out.
Yes.
Sharon,
You're gonna put them here?
yeah, we're gonna put them here.
We'll get them out of my car.
We'll get them out of here, because this is where we'll spend most of our time
Okay,
tomorrow.
great,
So,
great.
so you're free to. So this is where we're free. And I was gonna say, I had on the schedule that we would do some socializing over in Stone, but it is a little bit. If people are wanting to go to bed, it's probably better.
Yeah, right
We can you're here now, hang out for a little bit and head back when you want. We have 3 drivers. I can also drive people back if they need to drive back. So don't worry about in terms of I'll take anyone back. If you want to hang out here and play some games, you're welcome to play out here. There's again snacks and stuff here. So I mean, you're welcome to hang out in this area and have some tea or have some whatever.
Could you go around the room real quick with names just one
Yes.
more time?
Yeah.
Sharon.
David.
Chris.
Do you want name tags tomorrow?
Jill.
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 Bonnie.
Bonnie.
And Jason.
In the morning.
Chris.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
And maybe tomorrow when maybe in the morning we'll say our names before we.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just do it again.
Yeah.
It's all right.
Jill.
So we'll end on that tonight. I know that's a lot, but this is the introduction of the problem. And I'm sure you've heard some of this before, but Rich and I approach it differently. It's filling in some blanks for you, or some cracks maybe. But no, yeah, so this is where we'll end tonight, and yeah, if anyone up for games, you guys wanna play some games, let me stop this. No?